Hi, welcome to Soccer 3220 Youth Culture and Risk, and this week's content we'll be talking about youth culture, moral panics and generational culture wars. So to begin with, I'll be breaking this up into three parts, one part on youth moral panics, one part on generations and one part on youth culture. The first two will be quite short and then the third one will be a little bit longer. But to start with, I'd like to get you to check out this video that you can have a look at online at that YouTube link. It's an old clip from The Chaser where they, I suppose, use, Today, Tonight and A Current Affair Tactics back to analyse those shows. I think it's particularly a good piece of public sociology in many ways. So have a quick look at that. It only goes for about 5 minutes and it sets the scene for the rest of the lectures. Okay, so once you've looked at that, I'm going to start talk about moral panics, which that video just kind of dealt with a little bit. So moral panics is a concept developed by Stanley Cohen, and he actually used the term that was used by Jock Young in an earlier work and then developed into a kind of really strong, highly used sociological theory. He developed the idea originally from the very famous riot, in inverted commas there, between the mods and the rockers on Brighton Beach, which the film Quadrophenia was made over a fictionalised version of in later years. There's a lot of controversy, I suppose, about just how big that riot was, and just how many people were there and all that kind of thing. But Cohen developed the concept to think about the ways that events involving youth, particularly instances of deviance, particularly where they link up with pop culture genres, lifestyles, things like sex, drugs and rock and roll and all that kind of thing, the way that they're represented in the media, the way that they're distorted, sensationalized, and more importantly, after those kind of sensational and distorting, I suppose, media stories, what happens next and how that often results in more laws and more regulations and things like that. So Cohen theorises youth moral panics around these kind of events, episodic events, and he argued that moral panics happen kind of episodically every now and then. But I would say today that really moral panic theory, as I'm about to talk about it, seems to read more like an instruction manual for journalists to do their jobs today. The creating of panic and the creating of sensation and the creating of cliques seems to be the kind of key motivating practice amongst much journalistic practice. So there's moral panics about pop culture, lifestyles, subcultures, scenes, and that kind of thing. There's definitely moral panics over deviance, and there's also moral panics over threats to young people, the need to protect young people. And increasingly there's moral panics, as I've discussed in other parts of the course, around the way that young people apparently are making the wrong choices about careers, about not saving money and all this kind of stuff, which often has nothing to do with the reality of the economic situation. So as you'll see, moral panics are seem to particularly distort the reality of what's going on and present what's happening through a particular political lens, normally a kind of neoliberalised and particularly conservative lens. So an example of a real, example of a moral panicky type story is on the link there that you can look at. Now, just in advance, that story does contain discussions and images around suicide and self-harm. But what that story is a kind of Today Tonight story about emos that links the subculture through to the suicide pact of a couple of young girls, which is, obviously a tragic situation, but again, very distorting about what the emo subculture is about. So, if you would like to have a look at that, stop this recording and find that link and have a quick look. And I think that is a really good example of the way that young people's day-to-day lives are sensationalized, the kind of spectacular or deviant aspects are focused upon, and much of the kind of normalcy of kind of just living as a young person doesn't get a lot of airtime in the media. So that's a kind of that distorting factor I would talk about. So this is the first paragraph here from Cohen's really prominent book, one of the most highly cited sociological works, to the point where the kind of term moral panic is now part of the everyday lexicon. Really, people use it in day-to-day speech, not just in sociology or media studies. And this paragraph pretty much sums up the kind of the theory and the process of moral panics, fairly concisely. Societies appear to be subject every now and then to periods of moral panic. A condition, an episode, becomes defined as a threat to societal values and interests. Its nature is presented in stylized, stereotypical fashion, and then the moral barricades are manned, particularly by right-thinking people. These are often, in the past, were kind of, priests and police and politicians, and today you have a bunch of kind of various media experts and people that, talk about having expertise about whatever's going on at the time, what increasingly be called talking heads. They come out and kind of diagnose the situation, and then something has to be done about the problem, and this often results in more and more regulation. And then what also happens is the original group of people that have been stereotyped or distorted will react against what's going on, but in many ways this is then presented back as confirming the thing that happened in the first place. Again, what the result of this is, it seems to result in more regulations of young people's lives, more laws, things like curfews and stuff like that. So there's an initial problem, and then an initial solution, and then this Cohen talks about how these things are amplified through sensationalist stories, dramatizations, escalations, and that kind of thing. And then the kind of moral kind of entrepreneurs come out and kind of talk about ways to fix these things, often in really self-interested ways. Self-interested in terms of their own politics, but increasing today these kind of moral entrepreneurs are self-interested in promoting themselves and their own careers. This results in what Cohen calls a polarization effect, that the offenders don't really like the way they've been represented, and they often react with further deviance, in inverted commas there. This dovetails with further reportage and makes the whole thing kind of escalate even further. This is then received in the media by the experts as kind of proving that they were deviants in the first place, and the whole thing kind of moves on to the regulation phase, I suppose. Now, as I said, moral panics in this sense have been presented by Cohen as being every now and then, but you would kind of look at our media today, and particularly the way that the news cycle is 24/7 and people are connected to the internet pretty much consistently, that this is much more a permanent state of affairs now, and there's a whole bunch of research that talks about how our media increasingly is responsible for producing anxieties and stress, a culture of fear and that kind of thing. And rather than episodically here, it means that it seems that these things kind of permanently exist. Rather than just one happening every now and then, there's like a bunch of moral panics and a bunch of general panics, I suppose, happening at the same time. So McRobbie and Thornton's paper in the 90s that developed moral panic theory is really important in this regard, and they talk about how moral panics were kind of once maybe an unintended outcome of journalistic practice, that today they seem to be more and more the goal. And this is even more kind of complex and prominent now, I would say, in terms of the world of fake news and algorithms and stuff like that draw our attention in an attention economy to forms of panic, forms of outrage and that kind of thing. The work has also been developed in other ways, the concept of moral panic, to think about what it actually does. And one of the things is that it kind of acts as a smokescreen. By concentrating on, sensationalist, stereotypical things, it's a way of not talking about the underlying problems that may have caused the thing in the first place. And so the kind of media analysis here talks about how, focusing on, a bunch of young men that got into a fight at a skate park doesn't really kind of do anything to solve the problem, how there's not actually that much for young people to do in the world today unless you've got money to pay for it, unless you can consume in a particular way, unless you can afford to do official things like, go to the movies or go to the skate parks that you have to pay money for and all that kind of thing. So, again, there's a kind of moral panics here become a way of controlling ideas and, I suppose, representing reality in a particular way that kind of brackets out the economic reality for a lot of people, and the economic explanations and the structural explanations of why, certain forms of so-called deviance may happen. So this speaks into the kind of the politics of fear, and it particularly speaks into the kind of politics of labelling and the creation of figures that are kind of scapegoats, I suppose, for various problems. Scapegoats here being figures that are produced to individualise or pathologise social problems. So what happens here is that social problems become the blame of the behaviour of particular individuals rather than broader structural and economic understandings. You can see this around a whole bunch of different figures, whether it's in the past it's been youth gangs, criminalisation of the unemployed has been a really prominent one, and more recently we have stuff around the idea of boat people, queue jumpers, Islamophobia, and these kind of figures that are produced in moral panics to individualise kind of social problems. Who benefits from these processes? Well, the media gets sensationalist stories to get our clicks and to, maybe in the past buy papers, but today increasingly read things online. The police have a interest in the creation of moral panics, as it often results in more funding for particular kind of police presences at things or particular forms of technologies and equipment. And it's argued by moral panic theorists quite often that this kind of results in governments and political figures having an interest in them, particularly conservative forces, because there's a way of kind of ruling by fear by creating these kind of panics. That, by, focusing on violence, even though that, many violence figures other than kind of domestic violence figures and sexual assault violence figures are actually kind of going down a lot in different places across the world. It allows a kind of justification for more and more intrusion in our lives, more and more discipline, more and more laws. So the idea here is that there's a kind of political and cultural elite that constructs the culture where young people are on the outer, they're a problem to be regulated, and this obviously speaks back into the work of Peter Kelly's stuff about how young people are often the object or an artifact of expertise. And ironically, this results in a whole bunch of laws and services and control measures that often seem to then make the problems worse in many ways. So again, relating this back to Peter Kelly's work about how young people are in a constant position of institutionalised mistrust and governmentality, these kind of ways of producing moral panics is argued that it becomes about control, around controlling the kind of other of society, the people that are kind of marginalised and discriminated against already. In these terms, and specifically about young people, it's about controlling them, the other being the young person, and it speaks into those anxieties that adults have about young people in general in terms of their use value and their futures, but also more in terms of the anxieties how young people in many ways stand in for the future. And people want to kind of make young people good or whatever to try and ensure the future is good. So again, in some ways you could argue that these things or are motivated from, somewhat positive motivations, but overall they have more kind of regulatory effects on the lives of young people.